right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. Today we have Brendan Norgaard with us. And Brendan is an author, researcher, and community organizer, the founder of the Enlightened Worldview Project. And he's a friend of the Stoa and a player in many adjacent spaces, such as Game B, Integral Movement, the Build On Movement. And he wrote this really cool article recently called Comparing Approaches to Addressing the MetaCrisis. And there's a spreadsheet in it, and I love spreadsheets, especially spreadsheets on movements and memetic tribes. And the framing of that spreadsheet was different movements addressing the MetaCrisis, either consciously or otherwise. And so I invited Brendan to the Stoa to present on this, because I feel like this paper, and I love taxonomies that sort of move the conversation along, similar to Joe Lightfoot's liminal web session we had recently here. So I invited Brendan on, and he's going to share his thoughts, present on the paper, and we'll have a open conversation and Q&A, and maybe we'll pivot to turn the camera off and just have an organic conversation after that. So how today's going to work, Brendan's going to share, and then during the Q&A portion, just put your question in the chat. I'll call on you, you can ask your question to Brendan, and if you don't want to be in YouTube, just indicate that, and I'll ask your question on your behalf. So that being said, Brendan, welcome to the Stoa, my friend.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And yeah, as you were saying, it's like kind of a convergence of, these taxonomies of different ideologies, and also the recognition recently of this liminal web, and these various adjacent spaces. And also, there's been a lot of Stoa events about the so-called MetaCrisis. So it's kind of a convergence of all that. And so let me go ahead and start this presentation here. I guess I haven't done this. I do this share screen thing, and then I start this thing that should actually show just that. You guys can see that properly. Hopefully you can. All right. And so this is, recognizing the diversity and similarity among the various approaches to addressing the greatest challenges of our time, and being mindful of the points of agreement and disagreement as we chart a path toward a better future. So about this so-called MetaCrisis, I have to figure that most of you guys are familiar, but just to recap real quick here, we got there have been a lot of people talking about this. Some people call it the polycrisis, or I guess Alexander Bard just wants to call it a crisis. But then this is the recognition that our civilization and our natural environments in which we depend are simultaneously facing several interrelated crises. So it's not just one dimension. It's not something we can really easily take in. And we can see that our biosphere is facing an ecological emergency, and that we have serious failings in other areas of public life that are preventing us from adequately addressing this emergency. Most notably, our political, socio-cultural, economic, and education systems are all showing very serious failures or shortcomings, and thus we can consider each of these to be a distinct crisis in its own right. And these crises are exacerbated by a breakdown in public sense-making and by distortions within the information ecosystem. And probably at the core of all this is the so-called meaning crisis, which leads many people to confusion and alienation, and an inability to find sufficient intelligibility and purpose within their own lives. And so a number of events within the Stoa have focused on this. I came to understand this better through Jonathan Rowson appearing on the Stoa a few months ago and writing an essay, Tasting the Pickle, 10 Flavors of the MetaCrisis. And so he asked us to take this all in and stew in the uncertainty, and to understand the deep binds and constraints that are surrounding us and preventing us from seeking easy solutions. Unfortunately, well, so just, it's not quite as, maybe not quite as dire as we think, because there are now awakenings of potential solution spaces or partial potential solution spaces. So in a trend that has been accelerating in the last couple of years, lots of people have come together to establish organizations and media, online communities with significant in-person gatherings as well, for the purpose of thinking about and talking about the world and where our global society is headed, and people are starting to develop potential solutions to some of our greatest challenges. Many people have seized the opportunity to share concerns about the degradation of the natural environment and about threats to life on Earth and where humanity might be headed in the coming years. To describe this growing phenomenon, we have these similar and partially overlapping notions of the liminal web, recently coined by Joe Lightfoot, who also appeared on the Stoa recently. And we also have other similar notions of the sense-making web and the emergentia. And when we compare these people and these organizations and the ideas they put forth and the values that drive them, we can find a lot of agreement that the world as we know it is in trouble, and that we need to take this quite seriously. Within these spaces, intellectually diverse as they often are, and we know there's a lot of disagreement that happens, there seems to be actually quite a bit of agreement that we have this MetaCrisis, even if some people don't want to use that exact term. And I find that remarkable. So there is near consensus, even among those who sometimes come off as rather cynical, not to mention any names, that we are facing these interdependent and interrelated crises, and that these pose an existential threat to human civilization. Even for the people who wouldn't seem to want to be the type to admit that straightforwardly, there seems to be a lot of agreement. So how do we compare the various approaches to addressing the greatest challenges of our time? As complex as these challenges certainly are, some visionaries have formulated plans of action that might possibly help us to somehow avert catastrophe, avert dystopia, and work toward, a relative utopia, or a protopia, as the word sometimes is. And now that many different proposals have been put forth, we have the opportunity to compare and contrast them and to understand the similarities and differences. So we seem to have this agreement that we're facing these interrelated crises. Differences of opinion about what to do about it. There's a lot of interest in big change and a lot of agreement about our existing institutions, and the socio-cultural, political, and economic status quo is not viable in the long term, or even the medium term. Some people are predicting, like, I don't know, 10 years down the line, things are going to have to seriously change. And those who would agree with this general statement, or something close to it, would often have different reasons for why that would be the case. They all seem to have this agree that we need to transition to new systems. And we observe these diverse people and organizations work to envision various possibilities for our future world and that we might develop action plans for somehow working to address the MetaCrisis. And just in general, this notion of teleology is probably a foundational aspect to our conscious lives. It goes all the way back to Aristotle. And we tend to think in terms of ends and goals and achieving purposes in most of our activities, both as individuals and as groups. Naturally, the various organizations and movements in these spaces have some sort of teleology, some sort of vision for the future, and probably some outline of a plan to get there. So I created this table, and some of you guys see it, and I guess maybe the link is already there. If not, maybe I'll post it just to make sure you can see it. And yeah, let me just go ahead and make sure you guys have this here. All right, so looking at this, I was thinking that the most intuitive way to slice and dice it is, spiral dynamics. Some of you guys are familiar with that, and that is essentially that there's different worldviews or different thought perspectives or value memes, as they might be called, and that they inherit from each other. So I wanted to front for spiral dynamics. Every so-called value meme has at least one approach to addressing the MetaCrisis, whether the people at that perspective would acknowledge that or not. And so I probably don't have time to go through that all, but you can see that there. And so I wanted to show this diagram too here. And I probably don't need to spend a huge amount of time showing it here, but it's all in the link, right? So you can see what I did was, like, in pink, I have all of the what are called first tier approaches, and some of those are dead ends. Not to say that there's nothing that can be brought forward from them. Many of them can be, but then what we really get a lot of traction here is having the so-called integrative or meta-modern approaches, which I have in the two different shades of gold there. And the lighter shade of gold I have are, what I've identified is the primary, the first generation of these integrative or meta-modern approaches are they're based on ideas. They're based on the basic approach, but they don't get into the specifics on the implementation. And then some of those come together then for these second generation approaches. I know that the diagram here, there's a lot of lines going in different directions, and it might be kind of a little bit hard to see what's connected to what. But the idea is that you inherit from that idea. So there's quite a few things that are inheriting, for example, from game B. You can see that, Web3 or peer-to-peer or deep code. And, to an extent, perhaps I could have actually had lines going from everywhere to everywhere, but I didn't want to make it too busy. Perhaps it's already, a little bit busy as it is. But the main point is to show that these second generation approaches, they have more specific implementations for what to do on the ground, and how to bring ideas together. And these first generation approaches are more based on general ideas. So I think that, is in fact one of the criticisms of game B is that it's a little light on the details, but it doesn't need to be deep on the details, because there's other approaches that inherit from the basic game B framing that then in turn have that. And and just a few days ago on the Stoa, you had the debate between the Dark Renaissance and game B, and that maybe those aren't necessarily in opposition to each other. And in fact, let me go to the next slide here, because it has the kind of just a basic summary of this. What I've identified are the 6 integrative meta-modern approaches of the first generation, and that's important because these are kind of the more basic idea frames that then in turn can somehow play into the more specific implementations. So you have the Enlightenment 2.0, which this is, I think, best framed by Greg Enriquez, talking about the Enlightenment gap, how we don't know how to really integrate science and consciousness and what is our social life and how is that scientific, game B, and that's essentially a game theory way of saying, we're all in this game of life, and a lot of people are losing big at the game of life. Some people are winning big, but maybe we're all going to lose if we don't sort this out. In the Dark Renaissance, it's like the darker side of human nature, and how, if we think in terms of problems and solutions all the time, maybe we'll just make things worse. In meta sense making, it's like we need to look at how we make sense of things. We need to look at how we do that. And I was identifying also Nora Bateson's ecology of mind, or warm data, as a primary approach that seem distinct from these others as well. And she's basically saying that, for one thing, if we have these maps, like I guess I'm doing here, that's a little bit of a distraction, because these maps we have end up impacting the territory. So I'm not sure if you agree with what I'm doing here, but I have her as a primary, giving a primary approach here, and also I have bulk building 3.0, which is Lynn Rachel Anderson's approach that also seems distinct from these because it involves more direct community building and educational approaches. So, yeah, and then I'm saying, okay, well, there's these second generation integrative metamodern approaches, and I think I already kind of explained some of this here. But note that you can pick and choose and mix and match from among these, and either the first generation or the second generation or some mixture of these. You can find your own approach based on what you think will work, or what your community, what your group thinks is going to work. So some of these are maybe like the framing of this event is tribes. Like, these could be seen as tribes, but they don't need to be in opposition to each other. And probably our best bet is in addressing the MetaCrisis is in cooperation, collaboration, and coming up with novel approaches that incorporate the best of what everyone has to offer. And suppose I can go back to the diagram here. There's a lot of content in that spreadsheet. There's each one of those has a framing, general framing, and also an implementation. And you can see the ones I mentioned as first generation approaches have kind of generalized implementations. Like for Enlightenment 2.0, the implementation is to live wisely. And so what does that mean? Well, it means whatever is inheriting from that. Essentially, that's the more specific implementation of what we can do, because there's quite a few of these that do inherit from that and explain what it means to live wisely and how we can address the MetaCrisis, or address some aspect of it, like make education better, make our environment better. But probably what we'll need to do is figure out how to make all of these address each one of these aspects of the MetaCrisis and work in conjunction with that. So I guess it's been about 20 minutes here. I know Peter suggested I talked about this for about 20 minutes and take QAs, I suppose.
I'm gonna stop your screen share, and I just took a screenshot of this and put it in the chat, so anyone wants to look at that throughout. So first, well done, my friend. Brendan, a round of applause. Everyone loves a good a map of the noosphere. And
I hope the map doesn't, impact people's thinking too much. That's not really the point, but to get us to frame things, to get us to think, so that we can cooperate, and move forward, And the idea is not to be too disembodied, but while we're doing this embodied work, sometimes we need to take a step back and get kind of abstract, so we can figure out how to cooperate.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think there's a reason, probably a spiritual reason, why our space, whatever you want to call it, there's two moves. It's escape, velocity, meta, and embodiment. And I think they're kind of meeting each other in sessions like this. And so that's some of my questions I'm going to have on embodiment. But if anyone has any questions, put them in the chat, and I'll call on you in a moment. So and I do think it's important, you talked about what to call it, like the MetaCrisis, the polycrisis, the megacrisis, the situation. I'm actually persuaded by Bard's thing, just calling it the crisis, because it might be a little too precious, and pretentious calling it the MetaCrisis. But whatever this sort of hyper object that we're looking at, the strange attractor, I do think there's a kind of it being a superordinate goal, this kind of that we can kind of sense make around and kind of rally behind. And what you presented here, my understanding, it's sort of all the and I include myself in this, these kind of nerdy, geeky, para-academic people that like the system to theoretical philosophers essentially. But I'm curious, what the culture at large is sense making, or like sensing into. They're sensing it's the same hyper object, but like how are they making sense of it? And when I was watching that kind of dark comedy on Netflix, I think a year ago, Bo Burnham, when he was in his room, and there's a scene there, and I'm like, oh, he's talking about the MetaCrisis, but from maybe from a slightly leftist perspective, but it's like talking about the MetaCrisis. And then the recent film, Don't Look Up, everyone's saying that's a metaphor for it as well. So I'm curious, and this is maybe to the room as well, if anyone has anything put in the chat, but from your perspective, any kind of like cultural grokking of the MetaCrisis, maybe not with those terms, but any gestures that you see that you think were worthy to mention. And that's a question to you, Brendan.
So again, you're asking about the cultural grokking.
Yeah, so my understanding of what you displayed is sort of like a more of a para-academic, theoretical, philosophical understanding of the meta-crisis, but the culture at large seems to be sensing into this hyper-object as well. And any examples that you find, like whether the film Don't Look Up or Bo Burnham's kind of like comedy special, anything that your sense that you can point to?
Yeah, you're right. And just in the last weeks, since that movie Don't Look Up came out, I think people are seeing these interconnections, and just a few years ago, like when we had the 2016 election and aftermath, some people were just deeply focused on politics. Like, we need to figure out politics, and they were like, oh, whoa, there's a separate sense making issue. There's so much fake news out there, and then I think it's starting to come alive. People are starting to realize that there's so many different things that are interconnected. And I think, the movie Don't Look Up, as some people kind of criticize it for being a little bit, not just a little bit shallow, but I think they did kind of capture that.
Yeah, and I guess the curiosity there that I'm having is that there seems to be more cultural artifacts that are not aware of all these intellectual spaces that are gesturing at this hyper object, and it might be prudent of service kind of like meeting them somewhere, just by, like, we had a session at the Stoa, like Don't Look Up, related to the MetaCrisis. And I think more people who search Don't Look Up, then they find the MetaCrisis kind of like rabbit hole that might be of service. And then the other question I have is about embodiment. And maybe I'll share my screen because I shared this in the chat. There's this infograph that I quite liked. I think it came from Jonathan Rowson shared it at the Stoa, but I think it was from a Daniel Schmachtenberger podcast. And it's a pretty good infograph of the MetaCrisis, like what is it, the generator functions. But I thought this part was particularly interesting, is the attractors. Let me see if I can zoom in. Do you see that? And then they have like 3 attractors, but the 2 bad attractors are like chaos and oppression. And then like the prepper community actually have like models for this. They call it like excessive rule of law and without rule of law. And when I kind of like, as a Stoic, do your negative visualizations, and when I feel into the MetaCrisis, it feels pretty horrific. Those 2 hellish scenarios, like if like some kind of like, Nick Bostrom calls it the world and change scenario, and the extreme oppression, or like just like we return to the Stone Age after a collapse, and just like roaming gangs, and just feeling that in my body, like processing that's a lot to take on. And it's almost like I had this provocative thing, like each memetic tribe is like a cope, in order not to feel a lot of the intensity that could come online with the MetaCrisis. So how do you take kind of like embodying the MetaCrisis? Because there's almost, it's such a disembodied term, and almost needs to be, because it's like too intense to feel all at once. So I'm just curious, anything I said pings for you, and how do you kind of understand how all these memetic tribes are embodying the hellish scenarios that could emerge from the MetaCrisis?
Yeah, I think that, it's something that you can't really take in unless you move from one imagination to another about these different aspects of life and how they're coming apart, and how they're in tension with each other. And I think we do need more like works of art that convey that interdependent interrelation, because I think people have a tendency to get just pretty obsessed about one thing or another. We really need to focus on the environment, or we really need to improve our education system. And those are all very admirable. But just to recognize these sort of interdependencies, and I can't think of a way of embodying that without working within these different frames, and having that sort of a interconnection across that, not something that you can just grasp quite so simply.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the last share I'll have, like I remember before the Stoa, I was hosting a lot of in-person groups in Toronto, and then I hosted Extinction Rebellion, and they actually have like a good, like they give you a download. I think the presentation they had, they give you a download on the ecological crisis, and everyone just feels like shit, like right, and then it's like they do have some psychotechnology to process it, but it's like, okay, then go get arrested on like by protesting on the street. And it's sort of like what I'm getting from what you just said is like having a more like seeing the elephant, like all these Memetic tribes looking at the MetaCrisis, like blind men looking at the elephant, but like seeing the full elephant might like just stay a little bit with the emotional processing and then kind of like move wisely from there collectively. So anything else you'd like to add before we pivot to Q&A?
Well, I wanted, I guess I didn't talk about these different approaches that are there, these second generation approaches that are integrating them. It would take, a little bit of time, and I feel like I'd have to give 5 minutes to each of them. But I really appreciate several of those that are doing that, that are recognizing these different, seemingly independent crises, and how we can address, we can have some sort of stance toward the, the environment, the education system, the socio-cultural, political system, and we can work toward that, and some of these are actually pretty deep in terms of actually on the ground, and sometimes literally working, with dirt, and really literally, in these communities doing things, so it's not just a theoretical approach. So and that's why I wanted to separate these first generation from the second generation approaches, because this first generations, those are important. Like without those, we wouldn't have anything, that to latch onto, to be able to drive us when we are in these communities, while we are in the trenches, but I wanted to separate those just so we could recognize, the little bit of a distinction there between theory and practice.
Yeah, I really like that first generation framing. So put your questions in the chat. We'll do Q&A for about 30 minutes. And then if there's an aliveness still, then we'll just turn off the recording and jam for a bit. Alex, you had a question. You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, hey Brandon, great presentation. Yeah, I guess I was just kind of wondering about the aspect of collaboration and consensus between some of the different groups. I think I think there's something powerful about taking different parts of the elephant or the meta crisis and being able to sort of focus in on certain stuff. But at the same time, it also seems to me that if it is a if it's a problem of collaboration and coordination for the rest of the world, there might be the opportunity with all of these tools to be able to do it between us. So I guess I was just kind of wondering, like, what do you see as being the level of consensus that's necessary, or whether there's different approaches as to what is being shared across, what is being sort of promoted or put forward. Is there a way of making it sort of easier for people to be able to contribute into different areas, or be able to kind of reveal all of this maybe to a larger group of people?
Okay. Well, there's several different aspects of life that I think need to be kind of treated a little bit independently of each other, and this is why I'll actually show my bias a little bit and say that, I'm kind of sold, I think, on the so-called, listening society Nordic ideology, because of the way they have the separation of powers. And I think it's kind of a meta framework for having these different organizations and movements that can work in conjunction with each other. You know, some people, some organizations are really focused on better democracy, and some are focused on better sense making, and some are focused on better spirituality. And I think that we can actually have these separate organizations, you know, doing these sort of things. And we don't have to slice and dice it quite the way that it is in the Hansi books, where they have the 6 different types of institutions. But I think it would be something kind of like that, you know, especially as I'm focused here on how much of this can we implement in the United States, where we have a lot of money, a lot of influence, and poor sense making, and a lot of meaning crisis, you know. And I think that, you know, the Europeans are a little bit ahead in terms of ideas, you know. So I would leverage something kind of like that, having these separation of concerns, and you know, just that we would think of sense making as a pillar within this, and democracy as a pillar, and spirituality, giving people meaning in their lives as a pillar. And you know, there's others that we can consider as well. And probably also, you know, the shortcoming probably within the Hansi books is they don't get as much into, you know, actual on the ground, in the trenches details, but those are, I think, provided by some of these other organizations and movements, you know, that I've tried to outline here. I've tried to identify as many as I could. There's probably some that I missed.
Any follow-up, Alex? You're on mute.
Sorry, my bad. There was actually one thing that sort of just did come to mind in terms of the question of pace and maybe priority, as you're saying, in the sense of, it feels to me as though there doesn't need to really be a, you know, much of a sort of prioritization of what happens first, because, you know, it feels as though all of the different parts are just holding different pieces of the puzzle. But maybe ways of sort of coming to agreement, or even just responding to the pace, I think is an interesting question, as Peter was talking about the you know, the coming crisis. It's like, how do we define what is, you know, most important, or what is the time frame that we need to, is there a way of working back from that? Yeah, I guess I was just looking towards that sort of consensus or pace, if there's anything that
consensus or pace in terms, yeah. So maybe we would need to set up like you know, councils, you know, to figure this out. I think we've been trying to do that, but we don't want it to be a top-down approach, you know, for coordination. And also, I think there's one of the biggest problems or challenges for coordination is that people have different language, you know, have different ways of talking about almost the same thing. So there'd need to be a coordination effort on that regard, in that front as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. Jeremy Johnson, if you have a question, take it in.
Great, thanks, thanks, Peter, and great presentation, Brandon. Good to be here. Really like how the inheritance diagram is cohering a bit more, and hearing you actually articulate it and unpack it this cycle, this iteration. There's a lot more clarity, at least on my end, and sort of understanding how you're cohering these many different communities. And that's kind of my question. Out of, say, any of the sort of foundational first generation articulations, whether it's Game B or ecology of mind, warm data, or yin yang systems approach, or enlightenment 2.0, or Bildung 3.0, right? Dark Renaissance, there's these different approaches. Is there a coherence, right? Because I appreciated your the other chart sort of describing the diagnosis of the MetaCrisis from each one of these articulations. Is there a pattern of coherence you're hearing from each one of them? Is there a kind of constellation of meaning you get a sense of that might be a good place to actually cohere around, right? Like, so that everyone can kind of show up at the table and begin to understand, okay, everyone's using different language and maybe there's a different emphasis, right? But there's a general kind of pattern they're describing, a general kind of movement of culture and consciousness that's sort of underlying all of these different approaches to navigating the MetaCrisis. Do you see something underlying like that, a kind of cohering underlying structure? And that'd be my
Yeah,
first question.
yeah. Some of the people who I was showing this to and gave some suggestions to add some additional like columns, some additional metadata, like the role of technology, the role of industry, the role of nature, the role of the people, governance, and then we also Leland Beaumont was putting together some Wikiversity materials for this, where he identified whether these were revolutionary or evolutionary, whether they were based on individual or institutions, and so we could work more on that front and see if there's deeper patterns, and I think that's actually the way that we could work on this and make it more clear on where these potential points of collaboration are that would somehow pop out of the document if we got that data in there,
Yeah, definitely. Peter, if it's all right, I'll just follow up briefly with yes, and I wonder, and I'd love to hear your thoughts as well on this, if a way or approach to do that, like for instance, with my work with mutations and Gebser's work, it's a very phenomenological approach. And that for me, even though I've sort of been quietly moving in between these different communities, just sort of tracking things, I do sense there's a kind of underlying structure of feeling that many different approaches are actually articulating, right? So there's all these different flavors of it, but there is that felt sense. And I kind of wonder, right, if the more phenomenological approaches, I'm not trying to trumpet Gebser necessarily, but Warm Data, or even Lene Rachel Anderson's approach with sort of the epistemes, right, different ways of knowing, if that might be a good place to kind of feel into what that is. And if we can converge on that, I think there could be something very productive and creative that might come out of it. Another thing would just be just a brief comment if you because I haven't really seen this in the charts, but I'm thinking about the kind of pattern in which there's sort of first generation, second generation as a sort of dialectic or cycle, because I'm thinking of like Fred Turner's work from counterculture to cyberculture. And he talks about the whole Earth catalog and these intentional communities, and then moving into sort of the early cybertopic visions in the 80s and the 90s. And that how that was a kind of move from these more philosophical articulations to attempting to implement them, and then maybe those things falling apart, and then that returning again in the cybercultural turn. So I'm just wondering about, like, is there a sort of an iterative loop of kind of the foundational theorists and then the folks who go out and try to implement it, and that kind of informs the next generation of thinkers and writers that perhaps refine or deepen our sense of what this civilizational transition is all about?
Yeah, excellent point. And I for that what I identified as the yin and yang web of systems, and that was actually when I showed it to Joe Lightfoot. He said, you could have another one for Fritjof Capra and Jeremy Lent. And I think that was basically, in fact, you could look at back in the 80s, Capra was identifying this. They didn't have, I don't think they had the term MetaCrisis back then, but he was one of the first people to really identify these systemic problems and how they're interrelated. And then it wasn't they didn't have the data at the time to really see what was going on. But then that he I think had this implementation, which then in turn needed to be conceptualized. And then you had the more recent iteration of something along those lines with Jeremy Lent's work. So we could look at that, these sort of cycles for any one of these, and how the specific implementation became. They had to go back to the drawing board and think about the more general abstract concepts, and then come up with more specific, more better implementation after that.
Thank you, Jeremy. Lisa Norton, you had a question or share?
Yeah, thank you, Peter and Brandon. it seems like there's a theme in the conversation about, we're so socialized to map before we can enact. And I liked, Jeremy, your comment about, aren't these really different flavors? And Kim Willis has something in the chat about, aren't artists already doing it? And I think maybe those are all different ways of saying, or discussing the making special of everyday reality. So something that I've been chewing on, Brandon, and maybe I'd love to hear your thoughts, would be maybe we're already in the multiple experiments and that's what's really needed, but how might we learn to become better at comparing what we're learning across tribes, if you will? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I can see that, we have these. That's something as a parent as well. I'm getting into the different approaches. We have doomer optimism versus there's at least a couple others there that get into like how we can have better agriculture and better like stewardship of the land. And so these are in different forks of the diagram. And so how can we, I guess, learn from each other? How can we collaborate better? How can we integrate? I think that's what you're asking. And I think that on the one hand, if we're at least mindful of these different approaches and different organizations, and then you can do that. But I think that nobody really has time to learn about everything else that's out there. I think that inevitably you have people doing experiments on their own and coming to similar sort of conclusions as they're doing things, and but I think that I think it's good that we're talking about the MetaCrisis and not just overusing the word, because if we use the word too much, it becomes more simple. People might then there might be a little bit of how some of these more complex terms or hyper objects, they become less hyper the more we use that term, and people tend to think that it's more specific than it actually is. So we want to avoid that, and it might be that we need to change our language occasionally, but maybe we'd be better off keeping our language, keeping our terms, so that we don't confuse people. So these are admittedly things that I haven't figured out yet, but it's good that we're having this dialogue. I think that we just I think the best approach that we can have is what Jeremy was talking about, having this phenomenological approach, because it connects us to embodiment, it connects us to enactment, and it connects us to the perspectival and participatory knowing. So everything, I think, we should have these processes through which we want to reimagine or reconnect doing that. And I think that all of these approaches, when we do that, we can recognize that when there's a divergence of language or a slight divergence in community rituals, that we can find this connection across that. So I think that having this sort of a phenomenological approach, that flows through these different communities, would, I think, allow us to do that.
And if I would, just a quick follow-up, I love that you use the word divergence, because I think in the messy experimentation of encountering divergence is actually where all the learning is. So this relates back to that Dark Renaissance session that was just held here in the Stoa. I think that's just so key to learning.
Any follow-up on that, Brendan, or want to pivot to the next question?
Yeah, we can pivot to the next question.
Yeah, let's see if anyone is. Kim, I don't want to put you on the spot. You had a bunch of shares. I don't know if there were a question or something you want to share to the group.
Yeah, I was just feeling into the fact that I was kind of just dumping a bunch of stuff into the chat, things I was just feeling. Because I feel like I'm kind of always looking at myself, going like, "What am I doing? Why am I scouting in these groups? What's happening?" Something I notice a lot, and I thought it was interesting a few weeks ago when the people from the authentic relating came and sort of told the history of authentic relating, and they shared sort of this like a part of the arc of their process was at one point they thought that they were the ones, they had some unique idea or something that wasn't happening anywhere else, and I noticed because I kind of surf through a lot of different communities, and because I'm trying to like suss out what's going on relative to my own heart in and what I feel like from a soul level. So I've been, I'm trying to figure out who's resonating, who's feeling what I'm feeling, what are they saying about it, and then I'll have these experiences where everyone's like, it's like everyone's like down there, like we're gonna figure this out, we're doing something, and I'm like, I'm right there with them looking at the map over the table, and then I'll pull myself out and I'll go somewhere else, like I did a couple of weeks ago to Crystal Bridges, and I'm like, holy shit, like people are already doing stuff and they're doing really big stuff and they're talking about it from such a like accessible language kind of way that like a lot of people can enter those things, and then I laugh at myself because I'm like, what am I doing, and what are we doing? What are we playing? Are we playing a game about playing a game, and why? And I mean, I'm right here in it, so this sort of like magnifying glass, I shine it on myself because I'm like, what am I doing? And then I'll hear people being like, we got to start a group that's doing blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, there's actually 30 groups doing that already. How about like, what if we get all the 30 groups to come together? And what about instead of starting a new group, we actually like take some of the energy and support some things that are actually already happening? And especially like what you said about the agricultural front, there's so much amazing stuff happening there, and we love to go look at it as if it's not been looked at. And I'm so curious about that tendency, both in myself, about us here, about you guys, if you feel that, and maybe, yeah, like I made one of the comments I made was like this feeling of like, being this sense of urgency, and like we're down in a fox den because we got to figure this out. It's on us because no one else is smart enough to do it. And meanwhile, like, what is that about? Like, why are we doing that? There's some really incredible stuff happening in the world. And yeah, it's a question, like I said, I keep asking myself, like, what is this tendency, yeah, of thinking that no one else is doing it, or they're not doing it smart enough or fun enough, or what have you. So
What's alive for you, Brendan, hearing that?
Yeah. Well, I just comment on that real quick. I feel that as well. A few years ago, I was like thinking I want to create a group, and I just ended up creating a meetup group like Peter. In fact, the Stoa started from a meetup group. For me, it was in Sacramento, which is not a terribly significant city in the world scheme. But from there, I met a lot of people who brought to the table things like, oh, have you heard of Game B? Have you heard of this and that? And that was where I kind of started this idea, which is this enlightened worldview project I'm working on. which is kind of an attempt to, kind of how much of this can we convey to people, who don't necessarily have a background in these areas, so that they can improve their life and their community. That's one of the things that this article I wrote in the diagrams and stuff is kind of part of that. I know it's a little on the nerdy side, but somewhere down the line, we're thinking we can make these educational materials and community projects, to actually do things, at the community level, and actually do something, with it.
Yeah, my response to that, Kim. I remember, like, when I first started grokking the MetaCrisis and through existential risk mainly, and how, like, we can collectively die and suffer in like 100 different ways. I was like, oh fuck, how come no one's looking at this seriously? How come no politicians there? How come no corporation, no celebrity? And then there's just that, my mentor said something to me that was kind of like cool. It's like, there's no parents upstairs. I'm like, there's no parents upstairs. Like, so we have to do this. And like, my personal approach is just sort of like recognizing most species, there's like 99.9% extinction rate with most species. So we're probably going to die collectively. And then imagining that what happens in my lifetime, that happening, and getting right with that, like that fear of death. And then being cool with that, there's like a sense like, I want to live. I like people. I want to play. Like, I want to figure out how to like respond to this thing. So I think that move, like having being in right relationship with death and suffering, in order to collectively play towards this thing, because I think a lot of people are reacting. There's no like death literacy in our culture anymore. There's just this massive death denial, and then people are reacting from the fear of death, and hence through the suggestion that meme tribes are just copes. I could be wrong, but that's my sense and how I stoically deal with it. I'm going to make a suggestion for kind of like a more open kind of conversation space now, but before we formally close out the recording portion, any kind of like parting thoughts you'd like to leave the people who are watching this on YouTube, Brendan?
Actually, there's one clarification in that I wanted to offer. Someone asked, are these names of these project names my own? So I was just trying, and in fact, for each of these, entries, as much as possible, to have something that would kind of be an abstraction from any specific organization or person. But there is a mixture, and some of them, they're based on a specific person or a specific organization or a specific book. So that's kind of where it came from. So there's a little bit of a mixture there. And in some cases, I was kind of at a loss for what to call this, like you're bringing together, Jeremy Lent and Fritjof Capra, and then, it was actually Joe Lightfoot who came up with that suggested name. And so it's just basically, and I also apologize if some of these, lines going from one place to another, some people might look closely at the details and say they disagree or whatever, but the point is more about finding these areas of collaboration. And this diagram, we can come up with new versions that corrects for any errors or add more details as necessary, while also trying to make it, keep it intelligible. If there's too many lines going everywhere, it's going to be an even bigger, spaghetti. So the idea is to show where these areas of commonality might be. And we might create more diagrams like Venn diagrams or other kinds of things to see where the overlaps are and really amplify that, so that we can find ways in which we can collaborate, and actually have a tangible impact.
Yeah, I think it's much needed work, because it's like, there's kind of a precious thing when you kind of be in a Memetic tribe and the worldview. It's like, oh yeah, we have all the answers, but like, oh, there's other people, like, like they get the grok, the Venn diagram, like, oh, there's other people working on similar things, and they're also focusing on like AI risk or this or that, and like, okay, let's work together. So yeah, well done on the article and the spreadsheet, my friend. For those watching the video, it will be in the video description. And Brendan, do you have like maybe 30, 40 minutes after the hour just to have an open conversation? Are you cool?
Absolutely.
All right. So I'll talk about like maybe a suggested protocol for that in a moment. But for those who have to leave and maybe those who are watching the video, our next Stoa session is on reality distortion fields and unconscious mind dynamics with Zoe. So that should be fun. That's on Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern time. And how I thought we would do this when we stop the recording. So if anyone has to slip out now, feel free to slip out. And if you have to go to the washroom break, we'll just take a 3-minute break. But write a question in the chat if you're going to stay. Something that came alive, something that you think would be of service for the collective, whoever's going to be here, the 30 people, to talk about. That's based off something that spoke about, like how do we collectively address the MetaCrisis or something else. And then once we come back, then perhaps Brendan will pick what question resonates most, and then we ask that to the group, and then we can have a collective conversation around it. Does that sound cool for everyone? All right, so I'm going to stop the recording now, play some music, and then we'll go for a brief bio break. I got to figure out a cooler term than bio break if you're at the Stoa. Maybe a meta bio break.